Okay.
We're in week 8 already into Aeschylus and Prometheus bound. Um, so Prometheus is the one who stole fire and brought it down from Zeus to man.
Sorry, can I just before we get started?
Yeah, certainly.
How do we pronounce his name? I've always been thinking it's Aeschylus. Is it?
I'm not even. I mean, I don't even try because, quite frankly, there are a number of different ways in Greek, and different pronunciations occur over time. Which pick one.
Okay.
I've been doing some more of my medieval history studies, and it at times reminds me of well, Monty Python. So if you look at Shakespeare, some of the reasons for some of the puns and parts of the story that we don't get now, like raisin was how you'd say reason, like reason back then. So
Right.
raisin and reason, reason and raisin are very similar. So you can make a pun on it, like between grape and wine and a lack of reason. Or at the time of it wouldn't be a knight's tale, it would be a knecht's tale. So in
Right.
Old English, I mean, the pronunciation of knight was knecht, which knights who say knit. Knights who say knecht.
Right. Right.
So we're no longer the knights who say
Knights who say ni.
Yeah. So
Yes.
And then there's modern Greek, ancient Greek, ... So
Right.
Aeschylus is good enough. If you want to do it differently, I'm not going to bitch. The guy's dead.
Okay.
For about 2,600 years now, and I don't think he's told anyone exactly how he wants his name pronounced, or gone up to describe his pronouns.
Sure.
So anyway, let's get on to our class and discuss old Prometheus there. So we're going to go into a few different topics, looking at, well, theatre of the church, which is a way of looking at this. Interestingly, for 3 days every year, the Greeks would all stop working, and their way of sort of celebrating religion and having mass, I guess you'd say, was actually to have a Dionysian festival and to celebrate through theatre. So both competitively, which is something I think we miss in our society now, the competition of the Greeks was everywhere. So the Athenians especially, you want to be the best in everything. So everything has a reward, everything you go for. None of this modern society or postmodern society bit where we sit there making snowflakes out of children. It would sort of be interestingly difficult for any of this stuff. So Thucydides, for instance, who was abandoned, one of the things that would be taken as a given that people don't get anymore is that like you hear about exposure, and children were exposed if the family couldn't have them in Greece at that stage. But Thucydides got the riddle of the Sphinx and understood it, not only because he was left out and exposed, his father king wanted to get rid of him, but because the nature of exposure at the time. The bit no one seems to mention anymore is they didn't just put you on a rock, they nailed you. So you ended up with a limp or something like this, like Thucydides, not Thucydides,
Oedipus.
Yes. Sorry, wrong guy totally. Naval commander and historian. Anyway, but anyway, old Oedipus there with his little limp was because he got nailed, which you don't need to put it into the plays. A lot of these things are just taken. So we'll go over some of the meaning here, and the meaning of the name is very important. So the name Prometheus means forethought. So unlike Zeus and others who knew a little bit of the fates, Prometheus knew everything that was going to happen. He knew beforehand that he would have been, well, punished for bringing fire down, and yet he still did it. So I think this is a key aspect of something you've got to think about. People don't generally contemplate this. So imagine that you know the future. So this is part of the story of Dune, for instance, which is wanting to avoid your future because you know what it can be. You know your fate. If I do this path, this is what will happen. It may have good things here, but I'm going to suffer in this way. Imagine being Prometheus going, I'm going to go down and take fire. And by fire, they didn't just mean fire. It meant all of culture, plays, literature, everything. So the simplicity that we see in that is actually far deeper. So Zeus was very authoritarian. He's not always portrayed that way, but in this particularly he is. So imagine now that Zeus and Prometheus worked together to overthrow Zeus's father, and then Zeus starts, well, changing a little bit and becoming more of a tyrant. We know about that from some areas of our modern world, but 20th century has been full of them. And he's gone into rejecting even those who helped him. And it's a moral question here about whether we should break rules, whether we should bypass things and take consequences. We've seen that over and over in the themes I've given. Old Socrates there chose what was going to happen to him. Prometheus here chose. So Socrates, remember, was given the opportunity to leave. He could have been taken out into exile and left Athens and been alive. People would have done that for him. Prometheus allows himself to be bound. He basically gets bound onto the rock knowing what will happen. So there are also questions of divinity and power that have a number of interesting concepts. And is it right to stand against power in the form of political dissent? So if you look at Hobbes, of course, he'll go no, but then Hobbes is rather boring that way. I mean, in Leviathan, it's everything's too bad. We don't like anarchy. Just do what you're told.
Yep.
So, shall not the judge of all earth do right? So, should these things be actually created in such a way that we expect sort of justice? Tyranny and absolute power, the myth of Prometheus, it's really the trap of what happens when we get there. So to think about that, we moved from this, what some people will say, free people, as we moved around in hunter-gatherer bands. But as we settled, we also entrapped ourselves. Fire, villages, agriculture. Once you start doing that, it seems that we have more, but then we have bigger families. And then we have to have more, and we have bigger families. So it's an interesting little dichotomy. As we become wealthier, we also end up in early on a Malthusian trap. Now, we've got out of that because of technology, but for a long time, we were caught in that Malthusian trap where we kept going through cycles of poverty and failure. Now, the problem we have now is people don't realize that technology actually takes us out of that, and they keep going back and remembering as if it's just about a racial ingrained memory that these things happened before. So, theatre of the church. So, imagine, first of all, that all these plays were sort of packed full of all the people in Athens, all the males at least. And not the few thousand that people will often say now, but there are estimates of up to 30,000 people in one of these things. One, the people in Athens were smaller than us because of not having as good a nutrition and health problems, etc. But also just the way that they would pack. For those 3 days, it wouldn't be like we are, where we want a little bit of extra room and we don't want to touch the guy next to us. Would be piled in. So way more than this picture sort of gives. And they were quite complex and elaborate things too. They had the old Deus Ex Machina, which wasn't just the god coming in the story, but even pulleys and wheels levitating things across the stage. So old Kierkegaard there espoused that modern theatre is becoming a replacement for religion, which is ironic in a way, because theatre was actually a religious festival. So think about that for a moment. We're sitting there going, people are starting to worship this stuff, but it was actually the way that people in an ancient society did. So they would have all these sort of theatrical things to bond them and, well, connect to the spiritual and the divine. It was an incorporated form of Dionysian worship. So not like we see on television now, where we expect all the drunken orgies or whatever, but no, actually theatre, challenging people to think. It was a religious festival that extended. So all of the stories would have been known as well. Now, it's not like we have with reality TV and Twitter filling our minds, but imagine now that you're brought up from a small child on to the other with part of the stories as part of your culture. You're acculturized. You know these things. Even those sort of the upper levels of society in England in the 19th century would generally know many of these things. The Romans did the same sort of story. So they knew the story. They knew the background. You didn't need to fill it all in. It's like, imagine someone who's watched every episode of Star Wars multiple times and someone makes a fan movie. You'll know what should be there, which characters fit where, etc. And so you'd retell the story, but you find interesting ways of putting a bit of a twist to it. So if we look at some of the different remaining stories, like Sophocles has some of the same characters that we're discussing in different ways, and others do as well. We can see slight differences. Same story, same overall basic thing, but like in a movie today with a reboot, we have similar but different. So enough that you can not quite know what's happening, and be interested. So in another thing here was it was very patriarchal, patrilineal society, and one of the worst insults that you could call someone was a father beater. Think of that. That's not something you'd think of now, but if you remember some of our other things in Plato and have a bit of a think back there, you'll see why that was bad. But this is important because remember, Zeus rebelled against his father. He enslaved and beat his father. So tyranny was one of the worst conditions, but a tyrant became the tyrant. Zeus replaced the tyrant and became the tyrant. So Zeus is the only one who gets strict obedience. And this is something that we in our modern society don't really understand. We can't really think of things in the same way. It's hard for us to think, that guy said, well, maybe if you're North Korean, not saying that's a good thing, but I mean, they're being molded this way. So that's education. We can mold people to be a bit different, but it still has rebellion and we still have problems. So forethought. Imagine knowing everything in advance. Imagine knowing what you're going to do the next day and the next day, and then still choosing. So let's see, we've got many aspects of that. Zeus created Pandora to punish mankind, at least in some versions of this. My initial doctorate's actually on this topic. So Pandora was also in some of the early pre-Hesperodic terms not there as a punishment, but that changed later in Greek history. So there are multiple Pandora myths as well. Pandora retained only hope, but we quite often think of that as a good thing, like she retained one of the good things. But here's something to think about. Hope was in the same box as all the evils. So we retain hope, but the only thing that we have boxed there with us that we have is hope. And it was, to the Greek, in the same box as all the evils that beflict us.
Is that because without there being some kind of evil or something that's negative, I mean, if everything was always positive, you would have no need for hope?
No, it depends on how you look at hope. Now, imagine these people who sit around in like casinos to all hours of the morning, wasting all their money, buying lotto tickets, gambling. Isn't that hope?
Yes, I suppose.
These people who wait for something way too long and put up with things is a form of hope. So I actually think hope can be a bit double-edged. We say that it's a good thing, but maybe it's a bit like Loki. It's a trickster. It's a sort of little bit good and bad, depending on
we imagine an outcome and then we hope that it will come. But usually, because that imagination aspect is kind of boundless, you can imagine something that almost will never happen, but then keep waiting for it. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. So, and there is a lot of Prometheus in literature. We have Ridley Scott, of course, with the Promethean idea of the alien race who seeded humanity. We have Mary Shelley and Prometheus, or the new Frankenstein, or the new Prometheus, should say, where we have, of course, the recreated life form. And here we're rebuilding something new, sort of trying to be God ourselves and extending ourselves. We have the concepts of biology and science all mixed in throughout many sort of sci-fi novels of how we create culture, and aliens coming down and sometimes being good, sometimes being bad, sometimes being a mixture, and really bringing a new origin. So a part of it is also the ability to reproduce, etc. So if you think about the tale of Frankenstein or New Prometheus by Shelley, that goes back to the Age of Gold. In the Age of Gold, humanity could, according to Greek myth, reproduce without the female. Now, that's the interesting thing, that is a sort of, that flips the old story on its head in Scott's Prometheus. Not that I don't know if anyone gets it, but the female reproduces without the male. So, so it's no longer the male needs to, it's now we don't need males anymore. So nice little re-envisioning. So, and as we're doing this, we need to also think about what we had in each of these stories of creation. So imagine the myth now being the aspect of life in the trilogies here. The statues in huge form that would have been part of life, part of the culture. So we also want to remember, because of these stories, the problem with hubris, the problem of thinking that we're able to assume too much in life. So it's not just pride. So what do you think the difference between hubris and pride might be? They're actually both related.
I think pride is being proud of something that you've accomplished, whereas hubris is thinking that you would be able to accomplish something that maybe you cannot.
The way I'd put it is, you can be proud of yourself, but hubris is where you go to, and to the Greeks, challenge the gods, where you're on the edge of going, I'm good enough to be one of you. And the way that the Greeks would put it is, the gods don't like that. So you're infringing on our territory, and they maybe get a little bit jealous, and they don't like that. So they smite you and make sure that you don't do any of that stuff. So there was actually a trilogy, and there was a Prometheus Unbound. Unfortunately, that's lost to us. But our Romantic era poets, of course, have gone and recreated their own. It's okay, but I mean,
it's not the original.
Well, we don't actually know about the original, so we have a couple little tiny fragments which don't really tell us much. So Eumenides, Chloropho, we have different representations of Zeus through different plays, even by the same playwright. So part of that, of course, is, well, to these people in Greece, saying one day that Zeus is a tyrant, and then the next day that having him as a sublime representation of divinity wouldn't be a contradiction. The reason being, it's a god. We don't have the comprehension to basically understand any of this, and that's it. Too bad. Don't know. So, stasis and change. We have poor guy on a nice big rock there, eagle, chewing out his liver every day. The reason for liver is actually quite strange. The liver was the center of desire. So in to the Greeks, they would have saw that as they're seen it as the center of desire. So the brain was a big sponge that cooled down the blood, but the liver was like lust and all sorts of things like this. So not quite sure how they got that. I guess if you eat too many rich foods, you sort of feel it. But yeah, anyway. I didn't make this stuff up. There's a very interesting contradiction again in Prometheus. The protagonist is usually full of action. So we have a stage with someone bound and stationary. So throughout the whole play, he's bound. He's on a rock, unable to move, and he's also still there. So his power, force, basically, then Krakos and Beer, who are power and force, hold him down as Heptasius, Vulcan in Roman terms, puts him there with adamantine chains so that he can never get up, apart from, depending on which story, Heraclitus or Hercules eventually frees him, or Dionysus or Apollo frees him, or different stories in the future. But I guess he would have known anyway. If he's forethought, he'd know that after a few thousand years, someone will let me go. Yeah, one way of looking at it.
If you're a god who's lived for tens of thousands of years, or you know, as long as we suppose they might live, that this somewhat brief period of being bound and punished might be, you know, worth it for allowing mankind to kind of rise up on their own and in some ways get out from under the yoke of the gods.
Yep. Guess if you know what the future is, and you know the next million years, you'll choose what's best over the next million years. maybe occasionally you have a liver picked out. Anyway, but so you remember the story of Io and his daughter?
Yes. So she shows up about 2/3 of the way through, and in a pretty woeful state, complaining that she's been constantly chased by a fly, which is driving her crazy. But she's also been turned into a cow by Zeus, who I believe it was she refused something of him, or
well, Zeus thought, well, in normal Zeus type fashion, I'll go have it on with this woman down here. I'm a god, she'll find me attractive. And she went, no, I'm sorry, I don't feel like it. And then, of course, Zeus's wife, Hera, caught him, and he did the, oh, well, we better save you by hiding you, and turned her into a white cow, a heifer. And then, well, a gadfly, a big horsefly, was sent to eternally chase her by Hera. So, God, or gods, probably don't want to meet up with any of these guys. They don't sound like they're fun to have at parties.
They sound horrible. But then she kind of explains a little bit, or does Prometheus know who she is? I that part I'm not so sure about. But
Prometheus knows, but he doesn't tell. So
right. But then he kind of predicts to her, well, not predicts, but prophesizes that eventually her condition will be undone by Zeus, whom she will bear a child. And it is the 13th generation of descendant of that child who will overthrow Zeus and unbind Prometheus. And she, I guess, takes some solace in that, despite the fact that her punishment has a long way to go, and she's got to go on this big long journey and walk all the way to Egypt, that she will be turned back into a human, and that Zeus will be overthrown. And even by the time that she's been reverted, he will still be there, stuck on that rock.
And
every day.
So the person we're talking about, of course, is Heraclitus, or Hercules, if you want to be Roman, who, of course, many generations later, then kills his own family, gets cursed, kills him because of a madness put on him by Hera, goes through his 12 trials, and then gets tricked by his wife into sort of this super painful poison, but escapes dying by the poison by walking into a conflagration, a big bonfire, where he gets incinerated and taken up to heaven, where Zeus decides in his infinite wisdom to have him enter into the only new Olympian god, and become one of the gods, and yada, yada, yada. So whether he then overthrows Zeus is another question. Now, some people have seen Prometheus as stubborn, but I guess in some ways, if you know the future and you know every option you can do, wouldn't you be stubborn? I mean, if you knew everything possible, you know every path, you go, I do that and this is what happens, I do that and this is what happens, I do that and this is what happens. And this one, I get tortured here, but I have all that stuff happen that's good. This, I mean, I think, could you actually call that stubborn? I mean,
I would call it more kind of resigned to a particular direction of events, and so it's not really stubborn, it's just knowing that this must happen, and that it's not. So he's given options of, you can get out of this by whatever. Or I don't think he is given options at a certain point. There's just like, this is your punishment now. But he knows that the long-term outcome is better. So I don't know that that's stubborn. You know, in a stubbornness situation, often someone is taking the worse option simply because they are unwilling to change their mind about something. Whereas I guess he's already decided that the best decision for him is the best decision for man, and that he'll take that punishment.
So Alfred Whitehead puts down that we have three phases that we have God appear in: God the void, God the enemy, and God the friend. Now, even if we look at Christian religion or Judaic or many others, we see that time and time again. We see the start, the Mosaic law of Moses, etc. No one really thought about the afterlife. It was the now. How do I get through the day? Very much a Maslow hierarchy of things, even in religion. God the enemy, later on it became this guy who's going to smite us if we do something wrong. And then it transfers into the personal God, etc. And then, of course, we go back, as Nietzsche would say, and kill God and start all over. But anyway, so nature of power, this is a very, very cogent part of this. It's something we should really be thinking about, the structure of power and what we will and won't do. Now, for, of course, old Thomas Hobbes there, he lived through a time of civil war. The time of Cromwell, etc., Charles, that period of England's history was anarchic. The constant battles, the civil war, people were not able to live good, easy lives. There were a lot of people you knew would have been killed, etc. Now, that made him abandon anything to do with sort of standing up and saying, oh, we should actually challenge power. His answer was very simple: don't. Ironically, he left and didn't stay when there was a different power in there. So it depends on what he considers to be the just power. He didn't see someone like Cromwell as a just power. He saw the king as one. So, I mean, there's arguments on both sides. Okay, so back to our lovely guys with beards and no mustaches, and they're not Amish. The fun of these guys. So power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The reference thing is actually wrong on that, but that should be Lord Atkin. But that relates also to something in the book of Job. So we have a lot of similar stories. In the book of Job, we have a whole lot of, we don't know what to do about gods or power or anything like this, or God or power. And divine authority, well, can it be considered tyranny? If we must follow it, what does that say? The rejection of authority. Nietzsche would say that the liberal sort of view of the world that we've had, where we're moving into a now postmodern phase, leads to the death of God. And that's not just God in the way that some people would say, but the death of the spiritual. So the death of the embracing of something more within ourselves that us humans really need to have. So keep going.
You can definitely see that in the way culture is sort of turning. We've moved. It's gone from worship and sort of community to this single-use entertainment culture where we're constantly occupied trying to find something to have to not think. It's almost like, so the spiritual is all about contemplation and wonder, And that's been stripped away now because we're always distracted by this sort of entertainment culture that's been developed.
I would say more than entertainment. I mean, to these guys here, seeing these plays was entertaining. It was also spiritual and part of everything else. And you can still do some of this today, and it is entertaining. We don't get all the jokes anymore because, well, the use of words has changed. But it's still, if you know what it is, you can be entertained, but you have to be trained to know what they're saying. Whereas people back then, it was talking to the average person as well. There are a lot of silly things in each of these plays. You had the comedic plays where people would walk around very much like something out of the 50s and 60s, out of British comedy, with fake phalluses and all sorts of silly things during these plays as well. The Romans quite liked that, the potty humor that actually we think high culture, but there was a lot of sort of whoa type stuff at the same time. The frogs, etc. The interesting part of a comedy there, they could be quite satirical and equally very low grade. But when I'm talking about that, I guess it's the move away from the sort of this anti-elite type thing we have now. There's an anti-aristocratic element in our modern society, which, funny enough, would not have been there in the start of the United States. The Senate was very aristocratic. The people knew to sort of, you might be equal under the law, but that didn't mean like now everyone sits there going, "Whoa, everyone's equal and screw you, I'm not going to." So there was different attitudes. So part of all of this is, of course, not realizing that while we can change our position in society, that there are positions in society. Like it or not, that's always going to be the case because it's a zero-sum game. The whole concept of how much you have,
it's an interesting way of thinking about it. You know, in this equality society that they think they want, you're stuck in a box that you can never get out of, and everyone is in the same box. And it's whereas, you know, you need that mobility, that reason to strive to make yourself better, for progress to really take place.
Yeah. So if we go to the Promethean argument here, we also have the concept of Lutheran and rebellion. These things are not from God, we shall resist them. Of course, who gets to say which things are and aren't from God? Or rebellion is only warranted when authority is not validly installed or no longer aligned with its mandate. So in all of this, we need to remember, sometimes it is necessary to stand up and ensure that we challenge authority, but how is important equally. How we challenge, why we challenge, what we're doing. Now, if we consider some of the challenges we've seen in the world, look at Libya, look at Syria. These are challenges to authority, and I would argue that the mandate was not there. Gaddafi abused power and then got abused. But if you think about that for a moment, how you do this, look at the state of Libya right now. It's a basket case.
It's shocking.
They're still in scenario of ongoing conflict. It's still really a civil war. There are different groups. There's no real center of power. There's a power in this city and another power outside in the country. So if we're going to think about how we do this as well, it's not just we stand up to government and we fight things, but how we actually bring in something that's worthwhile. We don't want to just burn it all down. I mean, apart from the anarchist view of let's burn it all down and start again. Well, rarely does that work.
That's how we make a utopia.
No, we
start with ashes. And
if you read Utopia, you'll see that all we need are nice little concrete places that are totally boring and all have exactly the same gardens and decorations. And every 12 months, we move house randomly, because then if someone's done something like painting their wall, they won't get any benefits from it, so they won't want to do it. So they won't want to be different.
So you're saying we'll own nothing and we'll be happy in Utopia? That sounds great.
Well, that's what Silicon Valley tell us. I saw Jack Dorsey telling us how when none of us own anything, we'll all be super happy, like him.
Oh yeah, because he owns nothing.
Yeah, he owns nothing. He just rents it and things. There's a big difference, though. When you are an average person going paycheck to paycheck or Uber payment to Uber payment, it's a little bit different to when you're, a billionaire with a lot of money in the bank and shares in companies. I mean, he forgot about those. He didn't give those away. If he wants, he could always give the shares away and be like everyone else. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, my question is always in that scenario when you own nothing and you rent everything. For there to be a rental contract, there must be an owner. And who is that owner? Who is the person?
The one or two people. Mark Zuckerberg, he'll be one of them. Bill Gates, he owns like 10 million acres of America now. So Hobbes, in our anarchist view, would basically say natural state of humanity is anarchy, a life that is brutal, short, and violent. Now, that's something that a lot of people don't like. They like to have this, the world was so nice and there was a mother goddess and blah, blah, blah.
People just got on with each other.
Yeah, BS. Now, my answer to that one, and I've said this one before, is imagine that there's like you've got this mother goddess thing there and you found it, and it's not like Barbie, because modern society, Barbie, damn things survive like cockroaches. Plastic won't disappear. But remember, Athena was a female goddess. The goddess worshipped in Athens. So they are a goddess-based society, and the most patriarchal society that you'd have in anyone's mind today. Well, the Spartans are a bit worse, but even then the Spartans actually let the women train. The Athenians were probably even worse than the Spartans. They kept their women hidden at home, hardly got to go out, to the extent where people, I mean, there were lots of comedy plays about women going off to either weddings or funerals. Sounds like some of the modern things, like 3 weddings and a funeral, because the only time that you'd let them out would be to go to the wedding or the funeral, and thus people might pick them up. Someone might hit on my wife while she's at the funeral. I mean, right, as you do. I mean, that's where you're feeling right horny and things like that, because, well, oh God, grandma died. I mean, but yeah, so it was that sort of community. Women had no real rights in that sort of sense, yet they had a goddess. So religious nationalism confronts the secular state. So we see a conflict of authority and individual rights all through our society right now. We've seen that over the last couple of years in particular. So imagine now we are going through all of this time and time again, and we're trying to tell people not to comment and not to talk, and I say it too much, and they'll probably cut the YouTube channel where you're putting this. Is the role of government to I know, to rebel against tyranny? So the answer there is depends how, depends why. Now, old Gandhi, for instance, managed to get away from the British, but the British didn't want to be there anyway. But if he'd done that against the Russians or the Germans before World War II, they just would have drove a tank over him. Do you remember what needs to be done for a god to release Prometheus?
What must be done for a god to release? Is that why you're asking the question, like why he must be bound so securely? Because there was some reason why it was difficult.
He was eventually unbound, but
essentially
wanted to make sure that he never got out. Sorry,
Zeus was overthrown, wasn't it? And through that overthrowing, whoever came in, I guess, or the new leader of the pantheon would free him on the basis that his punishment was unwarranted given the new situation they were in.
Yet that's not really how it happened with Hercules.
Right. I guess I have to read that story and catch up. My mythology is, kids have had the Disney Hercules on in the background.
Oh God, that's.
Yeah. Can I just give a very dumb answer and see if this is what I mean? He's a god. I mean, the obvious answer to me is he could easily escape if it wasn't extremely secure. But what is the? But I feel like I must be missing something. So what's the real reason why he was bound so securely?
Oh, I'll leave that one for the moment. I'll let you do some research. So he needs to be for a reason, but I'm going to let you see if you can find it and come back to it. Remind me beginning of next one to ask me that question, but I'll see if you get an answer for me.
Okay.
So how do you think it would, to put a different twist on that question, how do you think it would feel to be Io and discover about your daughter?
What Io discovered? Or who discovered what?
Io discovers what's in store for his daughter. How do you think he would feel?
Io's daughter is.
Yeah. Is that because Io discovered her daughter is Heraclitus or whoever is there, or his? Sorry, it's not her daughter, but her son or something.
The eventual is Heraclitus, but
she still bears a child to Zeus after the journey that she goes on. So
I mean, it's still it's a bit bittersweet. Your daughter's going to be tortured for ages and driven half mad, but don't worry, she's going to bear a child that eventually comes and you have an eventual scion of Heraclitus. So what do you think Zeus, do you remember what Zeus wanted to do to mankind?
I don't remember, but clearly not have them be encultured, things like this, but I don't remember there being an explicit reason.
They were just to be beasts like animals.
Yeah, and he actually wanted to wipe us out again. Here's this history of it. So the flood myth and other such myths are all through this region, including sort of not only the Babylonian and other areas there, but also even in the Greek. So in some of the things, Zeus every now and again goes and wipes everyone out because nice guy. So that's why there's so many ages of humanity. He goes around every now and he gets rid of us. Yay.
Well, I guess we get too close to achieving the kinds of power that he has, and we have to be set back down into our place to rediscover things.
Yeah,
in a way.
interestingly, in the Aeneid by Virgil, in the Roman story, there's a difference in that the only people sort of surviving at the end, rather than going to another version of like a Iron Age and then, I don't know, maybe a Lead Age or something like this, created by people picking up rocks and throwing them over their shoulders, like the idea of person out of clay, and constructed in this way. And we spring up from all the rocks of the earth. Now, that isn't quite as bad as people might think, because the earth is effectively a bound goddess. Like, remember, there are multiple generations of gods, and going back far enough, the earth itself is a goddess. And so we're part of the body of the goddess, is really what that story would mean. But there are some interesting little twists between the Roman and the Greek, of course, who the Romans build themselves into the Greek story. I mean, Aeneas is part of the Iliad. He's in Troy. He's one of the few Trojan people who get to survive, and he goes on his own little journey, which Virgil has a nice sort of job of trouncing him around as well. But very much the distinction being in a very Roman manner. So whereas Odysseus goes and causes a whole lot of problems, Virgil has Aeneas as a much, well, less exciting character, intentionally. I mean, lots of things happen, but it's intentionally more rational and thoughtful, etc.
Right.
So what do you think the main theme of all of this happens to be?
Well, the main theme, I mean, I don't know, that's difficult to describe, but the most striking thought of everything with Prometheus is his something like his willingness to do what he thinks is right, or put it however you want to, knowing what his fate is going to be. So he seems like a hero. I don't know. What would you say? What does Brennan say?
I would say that part of it is that man is a vessel, and that kind of, without this help from the gods, if he hadn't come down and given us fire and taught us how to smelt metals and given us culture and language and all of these things that he gave us, we would just be a base animal, picking fruit off the trees and living in caves. And there's an element of that we almost owe this thing that we have to this god, who, by the way, was then strapped to a rock for 10,000 years for doing that for us.
Well, there's actually more if you go back even some of the earlier mythology was that we had fire, but Zeus took it away from us, and then Prometheus gave us fire back.
Right.
So
that's interesting.
Which there's a bit of capriciousness from the gods in that sort of part of the story, but I guess part of what to an Athenian we would actually get is we have a story about sort of justice, what is right, tyranny, etc. Remember, Aeschylus would have been doing this around the time of when there had been a tyranny, there had been others who were forming oligarchies, there had been this outing of the democracy, then coming back. So you have to also think about the political scenario at the time. And there's a lot of sort of, if you are remembering tyranny and you remember sort of freedom, you're going to react differently. So know quite a lot of people in Eastern Europe. Like Enchain has some offices over there, and we have people hired, and some people I quite like. But to them, people around my age anyway, they remember still the past when they grew up. So they're more sort of anti-authoritarian government than a lot of people in the traditional West, like America or Britain now, because most of us, especially the kids, have forgotten.
Yeah.
I mean, I might be old enough to remember the Cold War and Pinochet on the other side and yada, 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 but a lot of my daughter would have no idea. Try and point these things out, but no interest. So there's a difference when you have been through these things to how you see it. So yeah, so a few little references, and for those who want to go for extra reading in there, them and the next bit. And that's about it for today. So any questions or other such things?
Yeah, I do have one question. I'm just curious your view, Craig. So when I read this, to me, there's this, I don't know, big picture question of the relationship between mythology and fictional stories. And it seems like this, you know, the way they sort of, you know, the whole thing is just a story. It's an entertaining story about these gods and all this stuff that happened. And how, you know, did they really believe in gods in a different way than fictional characters? I mean, like, how do we even know they believe? Did they really believe in this like a religion, or is it their form of a you know, essentially entertainment? Or you know, then the question is something like, what is your view of the relationship between mythology and fiction?
All right, so if you look at Lucretius, there are ideas of the universe is just a bunch of particles, us people just turn into dust, and gods, whatever. Equally, there are those who are fundamentalist, orthodox, etc. So even back then, like now, there are those who believe strongly, and there are those who have don't believe at all, and there are those in the middle. But the mythology is, in my opinion, important. The reason for the mythology being important is that it's a way of transmitting a story that we all have. So there are many myths even now. So if you think of the Star Wars saga, that's a modern myth. Many other stories are based on old stories that are sort of well, rebooted time and time again, sometimes without even admitting where they came from. Someone like myself, who's done a lot of classical studies, actually finds it quite interesting. Even sometimes with young people who I'm studying with, as an example, I'm doing modern literature studies in one of the unis I'm associated with, and there are people who don't understand that, like Kafka's Metamorphosis is really a play on Metamorphosis by Ovid, or that Ulysses is the Roman name of Odysseus. So there are a lot of underlying stories and myths, but they help people understand. And now it's easier to sit there and go, oh, well, if you were just smarter, you'd get it, and try and tell everyone in society that this is how culture works, just do it. But not everyone is. And in sharing these things, it's an underlying aspect of how we can disseminate information about ethics and justice and understand the meanings. So one of the themes you'll notice that I've already put into this is about definitions and understanding. We started with what is justice? And it's a hard concept to define. So, but you can define it with story. So we can have the ethical dilemmas and people can understand them and see the problem and go, the bad guy, the good guy.
Yeah.
And that's the power of myth and story. It's Pan-Narans. Terry Pratchett and Professor Cohen, physicist, renamed us sort of humans Pan-Narans, storytelling ape. Storytelling chimpanzee is what they called us. And I think in many ways we happen to be.
Okay, got it. So yeah, I mean that's that's also a reason to have a sort of a common theme of education, like a common set or a common canon, the Western canon, because only if we share these stories in common can we actually relate about these ideas. So can we have a debate about the meaning of justice? Was it just for Zeus to hang up Prometheus against a mountain for however long? We have to have that in common. So anyway, that's it. So yeah, something like you don't have to answer the question whether it's actually whether these things literally happened or not. You can actually regard them as being useful, even if they're fictional stories or religion. And then also there was probably a spectrum, as you say. So it's something like some people probably literally believe these things, some people probably didn't, but they can still be a part of the culture either way.
So it's also interesting that there are hints of truth in mythologies. For instance, the Thebans used to do these elaborate things where they jumped over bulls and who knows what they really did, but they painted themselves doing acrobatics on bulls. And the Myonesian, the Cretan sort of palaces were labyrinthine. So it becomes into bull creature, labyrinth, things evolve. Even Achilles, if you think about a person in full armor at the time with the metal greaves, the breastplate, they're nearly invulnerable to an average peasant with sticks and rocks and things like that. This guy is invulnerable. But one area they didn't cover was the lower legs because they wore sandals. They didn't have boots at the time. When I explained that to my wife, she said, why don't they have boots? And my comment was, they hadn't invented them yet. And you can't just make metal shoes because they're hard to walk in. I mean, you can make metal shoes, but you fall over. So, yeah. So there's generally truth in myth as well. I mean, the reason we finally found Troy over there in Turkey was a bunch of people believed the myths and went out searching, and turned out there actually happened to be a place. But stories over generations change. So what might be truth and a kernel of truth, what it ends up with.
I guess with the Trojan myths, that there's a lot that sort of happens that really there's not, while the gods are talked about in that story, it really is men doing things to other men. There's nothing really that happens in that story that's has the gods coming down and simply the act of being chained to a rock for 10,000 years. That's not something that a human could have happened to them, because they would die.
No, but on a different note, it's interesting to think whether a Greek god could really be, we could put any human emotions or expression to them. I mean, someone who's immortal, never dies, do we really consider that there can be like heroism? I mean, could a god really be heroic if they can't die? So anyway, that's a different
yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right.
See you next week.
Catching you next week.